Charles Adams had just turned 75, but he felt much younger. This happens when a person lives in harmony with himself and doesn't come into conflict with the outside world. Charles lived in a nice house that he was proud to have built himself. All his life, the man dreamed of becoming a farmer, but it didn't work out. At his advanced age, it became a completely unattainable goal. Charles tried not to dwell on this fact and was hopeful about the future. Those who knew Charles knew what the true reason was behind his failures. Charles's main problem was his children, who believed that others were responsible for their happiness. Darcy and Fred were born 1 year apart and were very loved by their parents. Everything was going well until Darcy and Fred became teenagers. Fred was the first to develop issues. He periodically got into trouble because of his poor performance in school and frequent absenteeism. Some said that Fred was involved with gangs and conducted some very shady business at night. For some reason, the teenager was able to get away with everything. But when the police got involved, Charles tried to reason with his son. Unfortunately, nothing good came out of that attempted educational moment. Rebecca was the first to understand that her son would lead a questionable life that he himself had chosen. But like any mother, she kept hoping that he would improve and achieve something positive in his life. But when her daughter, Darcy, began to follow in her brother's footsteps, Rebecca began to despair. The woman could not understand how it happened that their children became simply unbearable. Of course, the parents made every effort to direct Fred and Darcy onto the right path, but they were unfortunately unsuccessful. Tired of yet another series of fights and confrontations, Rebecca understood that she could not live like that any longer. There had been previous disagreements between Rebecca and Charles, but it had finally reached the point of no return, and Rebecca decided that divorce was the best solution to their situation. Rebecca's decision made Charles go into a state of severe shock. He hoped that they could help their children, but when left to deal with the problem alone, he understood that the undertaking was doomed to failure. After the divorce, real trouble awaited Charles. His children had already gone astray and graduated high school with great difficulty. They refused to continue their education and began to live a life that was practically no different from that of vagrants. Darcy and Fred abused alcohol and spent their father's money, which he earned with great difficulty. Rumor had it that in the meantime, Rebecca got remarried and began a new life. Charles did not hold a grudge against her, knowing that he too was responsible for what had happened. Time passed, and Darcy and Fred continued to get into a lot of trouble. Fred served time in the state county jail, and Darcy had several unsuccessful attempts to start a family. Charles repeatedly asked his children to come to their senses and think about their futures, but it was all in vain. Charles eventually got tired of his endless, futile attempts to reason with his children and accepted reality. When he heard a knock on his front door, he immediately knew that his son or daughter came to ask for money. Being a kind and caring father, he never refused to help his children. He tried to give them everything to make them happy. Unfortunately, Darcy and Fred's happiness depended only on having access to money with which they could buy alcohol and some food. Despite their age, the siblings did not work and behaved as if they were the children of a millionaire. At the same time, Charles lived very modestly in order to save some extra money for his children. Deep down, the man understood that he could no longer influence his children. Therefore, he tried not to notice their oddities and didn't think too much about their way of life. "Hi, Daddy. How are you?" Fred asked as soon as he opened the door. Charles began to open his mouth to answer, but was immediately interrupted by Darcy. "I can see that you're doing well. You even bought a new sofa." Charles lowered his eyes in embarrassment. He really did buy himself a new sofa because he could no longer sleep on the old one due to back pain. After entering their father's house, Fred and Darcy began to walk around, examining and measuring each room. Charles did not immediately understand what they were doing. But when he did find out, he started to feel uneasy. "Dad, you know that I have heart issues and need money for surgery. And you really don't have a need for such a large house. After all, it's designed for a family, and you live alone." Darcy began to speak. Charles wanted to say something, but Fred continued where his sister left off. He began to complain about his bad luck and a loan that he had taken out from the bank. At the same time, he didn't say what he had taken out the loan for. Charles was not in the habit of controlling his children's every step. After all, his daughter's health was on the line, and Fred could also suffer if he didn't repay the loan. Since he had a criminal record, he could even go to jail. "So, what should I do?" Charles asked. "Actually, you don't really need to do anything. We've already taken care of everything. A place has been prepared for you in a nursing home. There you can spend time with people your own age and not worry about the future. You'll always have food and clean clothes," said Fred. Charles considered Fred's words. He did not want to leave his home at that age, but he also didn't feel comfortable not helping his children. Perhaps the nursing home wasn't such a bad idea. There was some rationality to what Fred was saying. Otherwise, who would take care of him in old age, which was just around the corner? Charles naively thought that he would have a week or two to pack for the move, but Fred insisted that they pack and leave immediately. "What will happen to my dog?" the man asked anxiously. "We've already taken care of that and found him a place at an animal shelter," Darcy answered immediately. At that moment, Charles felt incredibly bad and guilty. Buddy, who was Charles's loyal friend for over 10 years, would be forced to live out his days in a shelter for homeless animals. But on the other hand, Darcy's health was at risk, and Charles was not willing to sacrifice it. Therefore, he sighed sadly and began to pack. Actually, he didn't have much to pack. He lived modestly and rarely spoiled himself with new things. The sofa was one of the only new things that he had purchased in a while, but it wasn't something that he could take with him. "It's okay, Dad. We will ask the new owners of the house to buy the sofa from you," Darcy reassured her dad. On his way to the nursing home, Charles felt very uncomfortable. He was worried about whether he would fit in at the institution and make friends. In the meantime, Darcy and Fred thought about something completely different. Mentally, the conspirators were already dividing up the money that they would get from selling the house. Darcy actually didn't have any heart problems, and Fred didn't take out a loan from the bank. It was all a hoax to steal money from their dad. They already found buyers and just needed to get their father out of the house. To Charles's surprise, the nursing home was actually pretty nice. He was immediately surrounded by care, acceptance, and attention. Of course, the institution could not replace a real home, but it was certainly better than many other places that old folks ended up in. When saying goodbye, Darcy and Fred promised to visit their father in a couple of days. In reality, however, they had no plans to visit. After selling the house, Darcy and Fred plunged into the abyss of alcohol and endless partying with their friends and acquaintances. The money they got from selling the house did not last long. At the same time, they didn't realize that their dad had basically nothing to sell. 2 weeks flew by like a single day for Darcy and Fred. Waking up from yet another bender, they realized that there was no money left and something had to be done about it. It was then that Darcy suggested that they ask their dad for his life savings, some of which he had put aside for his funeral. Being a prudent and organized man, Charles always had a certain sum of money put away to cover his funeral expenses in case of his death. Probably a lot of people do this, and Charles was no exception. Fred really liked Darcy's idea, since free money always tempted the moocher. While the siblings were devising yet another story to tell their father, Charles was working on a plot of land located behind the nursing home. It is worth noting that the nursing home was located in an incredibly beautiful area. A river flowed within walking distance from the home, and a luscious forest grew on both sides of the river. It was difficult to build a house there. Only a select few could afford to buy a plot in that location. Charles put on his gardening gloves and began to trim roses and remove last year's leaves from the lawn. At that moment, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a woman heading towards the 2-story house, located half a mile from the nursing home. Charles knew that rich people lived there, as they could afford a house in such a desired area. The face of the passing woman seemed familiar to Charles. "Rebecca, is that you?" Charles exclaimed in surprise. The woman stopped and looked at Charles, who was dressed in a working uniform. At that moment, a sweet smile appeared on her lips, and Charles knew that it really was her. "Yes, it's me. How did you end up here?" Rebecca asked, still in disbelief. Charles shuffled from foot to foot and began to explain that he had sold the house to pay for Darcy's surgery and pay off Fred's debt. After listening to her ex-husband, Rebecca turned pale. Unlike Charles, she did not believe Fred or Darcy's stories. Therefore, without saying a word, she immediately called her assistant, who dealt with all sorts of delicate matters. As it turned out, after her divorce from Charles, Rebecca married an influential businessman who was 15 years older than her. It just so happened that they lived together for only a short amount of time, after which the millionaire died, leaving his wife a large inheritance. Of course, Fred and Darcy didn't know that their mother was wealthy and lived in a house that cost a fortune. After saying goodbye to Charles, Rebecca promised that she'll visit him soon. Running into his ex-wife stirred up the warmest feelings for Charles. Of course, deep down he still loved her and hoped that they could one day return to their old lives. Rebecca's probing revealed that Darcy and Fred deceived Charles and had long ago squandered the money they had got from selling the house. At the same time, the cunning children did not suspect that Rebecca would tell Charles the truth. By the time of their visit, Charles already knew about their children's deceptions. "Hey, Dad, we need a bit more money," Darcy began. To Fred's great surprise, Charles shook his head and said that he wouldn't be giving them a cent. "Dad, how come?" Darcy was shocked. At that moment, Rebecca appeared from around the corner. Fred and Darcy became visibly uncomfortable. At that moment, the siblings realized that their lies came to light and that they would not be seeing any more money. What's more is that Rebecca and Charles decided to move in together. "Live as you wish, but forget the way to our house," the woman said to her children in parting. It took Darcy and Fred a long time to recover from what they saw. They couldn't believe their eyes as they watched Rebecca and Charles walk away. Despite the couple's age, they decided to start over. Now that the former spouses had everything they couldn't even dream about before, their lives will certainly change for the better.